Colonel Rebecca Hawk Morrison grips the controls of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, her weathered hands steady despite the immense pressure weighing on her shoulders. At 52, she's flying through enemy airspace at 40,000 feet, invisible to radar. Carrying the most critical payload in American military history, the mission they said she was too old to fly. The mission that will either save millions of lives or plunge the world into nuclear war. Her gray-streaked hair is tucked beneath her helmet, and her steel blue eyes scan the instruments with the precision of someone who has spent 3 decades mastering the art of flight. In 12 minutes, she'd either be a hero or a memory. Path to this moment began 6 months earlier at Edwards Air Force Base, where Rebecca had been relegated to training new pilots and conducting routine test flights. The base buzzed with its usual activity, but there was an underlying tension that seasoned personnel could sense. International relations had deteriorated rapidly, and whispers of potential conflict filled the briefing rooms and mess halls. Rebecca walked through the corridors with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen it all, her uniform bearing the ribbons and decorations of a distinguished career that spanned from the Gulf War to Afghanistan. Her office overlooked the flight line, where sleek aircraft sat like predatory birds waiting for their next mission. The walls were covered with photographs from her deployments, commendations, and a faded picture of her father, Major General Thomas Morrison, who had flown B-52s over Vietnam. Aviation was in her blood, a calling that had shaped every decision she'd made since she was 12 years old and first saw the Thunderbirds perform at an air show. She had fought harder than most to earn her wings, breaking barriers in a male-dominated field, when women were just beginning to be accepted in combat roles. The irony wasn't lost on her that after spending her career proving she was good enough, she now found herself fighting to prove she wasn't too old. The younger pilots respected her experience, but the Pentagon brass had different ideas about who should be flying the most sensitive missions. Age discrimination in the military was subtle but persistent, hidden behind concerns about reaction times and physical stamina. Rebecca had watched colleagues her age pushed into desk jobs or early retirement, their decades of experience dismissed in favor of younger, supposedly more capable hands. Her marriage to David, a fellow pilot, had been another casualty of her dedication to service. They had understood each other's passion for flying, but the demands of military life and her determination to excel had created distances that couldn't be bridged. Their divorce had been amicable, but it left Rebecca with a profound sense that the Air Force was all she had left. Her apartment near the base was spartanly furnished, containing little beyond her books on military history and aviation, a few personal mementos, and a collection of model aircraft that represented every plane she had ever flown. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Rebecca was reviewing flight training schedules when her assistant knocked on her door. "Ma'am, General Harrison wants to see you in the conference room immediately." The tone suggested this wasn't a routine meeting. Rebecca straightened her uniform, checked her appearance in the mirror, and walked down the hallway wondering what crisis had emerged that required her immediate attention. The conference room was filled with personnel she didn't recognize, their suits and serious expressions marking them as intelligence operatives or Pentagon officials. General Harrison, a man she had served with in Iraq, sat at the head of the table with an expression she had never seen before. The weight of whatever burden he carried was visible in his posture, the way his normally straight shoulders seemed to sag under invisible pressure. "Colonel Morrison," he began, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. We have a situation that requires the most experienced pilot we have." He gestured to a woman in a dark suit who activated a presentation screen. Satellite imagery filled the display, showing what appeared to be a heavily fortified compound in a mountainous region. "Intelligence indicates that a hostile nation has acquired nuclear materials and is preparing to deploy," them against major American cities within the next 48 hours. Rebecca felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with high-stakes missions, but she remained composed. "What's the target, sir?" The woman in the suit stepped forward, her expression grim. "This facility is buried deep underground, surrounded by the most advanced air defense systems in the world. Conventional strikes won't penetrate deep enough, and any obvious military action could trigger immediate retaliation against civilian populations." The general leaned forward, his eyes meeting Rebecca's directly. "We need someone to fly a B-2 Spirit through their airspace, undetected, and deliver a specialized bunker-busting payload that will neutralize the facility without causing widespread radiation contamination. The flight profile is unlike anything we've ever attempted. The pilot will need to maintain stealth configuration while flying at extremely low altitudes through mountain terrain, using valleys and ridges to avoid detection." Rebecca absorbed the information, her mind already calculating the challenges such a mission would present. Night flying through mountains in a stealth bomber was difficult enough under normal circumstances, but doing it while maintaining the precise parameters needed to avoid detection would require skills that came only from decades of experience. "What's the timeline, sir?" 18 hours, the general replied. "The mission launches at 03:00 tomorrow." Rebecca nodded, understanding the urgency, but then noticed the uncomfortable silence that followed. The general's expression shifted, and she sensed there was more to the conversation. "Colonel, I need to be direct with you. The mission parameters are extremely demanding, and there are concerns about whether someone with your experience level should be assigned to such a critical operation." The euphemism stung, but Rebecca had heard it before. Experience level. Age. The suggestion that her decades of flying somehow made her less capable rather than more so. She had seen younger pilots struggle with complex missions that she could handle instinctively, but the perception persisted that older meant slower, less sharp, less capable of handling the split-second decisions that combat flying required. "Sir, I've logged more hours in stealth aircraft than any pilot in the Air Force," she said calmly. "I've flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts, and I've never failed to complete an assigned mission." The general nodded, but his expression remained conflicted. "I understand your record, Colonel, but this mission is different. The margins for error are essentially zero. If something goes wrong, there's no backup plan, no rescue mission, no second chances." Rebecca felt a familiar fire building in her chest, the same determination that had driven her through flight school when instructors doubted her abilities, through her first combat missions when colleagues questioned her nerve, through years of proving that she belonged in the cockpit of America's most advanced aircraft. "General, with all due respect, this is exactly the kind of mission my experience has prepared me for. The young pilots you're considering have impressive skills, but they lack the judgment that comes from flying in situations where everything goes wrong." The intelligence operative spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Colonel Morrison, we've reviewed your record extensively. Your tactical knowledge and flying ability are beyond question. But we need someone who can adapt to rapidly changing conditions, someone whose reflexes and decision-making speed are at their peak." The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt the weight of every year of her life, every gray hair, every morning when her joints reminded her that she wasn't 25 anymore. The meeting continued for another hour, with Rebecca sitting silently, as the assembled officials debated her fate. Charts and statistics were displayed showing reaction times, physical fitness standards, and psychological profiles of younger pilots who were being considered for the mission. Each data point felt like another nail in the coffin of her career, reducing 3 decades of exemplary service to numbers on a spreadsheet that suggested she was past her prime. Major Lisa Chen, a 28-year-old pilot with impressive credentials, was mentioned repeatedly as the preferred candidate. Her test scores were exceptional, her physical fitness ratings were perfect, and her simulator performance on stealth missions was flawless. Rebecca had actually trained Chen during her transition to the B-2 program, watching her develop from a promising trainee into a skilled pilot. But Chen had never flown a combat mission, never experienced the chaos and uncertainty that turned textbook procedures into life-or-death improvisation. Major Chen's reflexes are measurably faster, the intelligence operative continued, clicking through slides that showed brain scans and reaction time measurements. Her hand-eye coordination scores are in the top percentile for all active pilots. These factors become critical when flying at low altitude through mountainous terrain with zero margin for error. Rebecca wanted to point out that reflexes meant nothing without the wisdom to know when to trust them. But she remained silent, understanding that her words would be dismissed as the protests of someone clinging to a career that had already passed her by. General Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command decision. "Colonel Morrison, I want you to know that this decision isn't a reflection of your abilities or your service record. You're one of the finest pilots I've ever worked with, and under normal circumstances, you'd be my first choice for this mission." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten at the familiar pattern of praise followed by dismissal. However, the stakes are too high to allow personal considerations to override objective analysis. The room fell silent as Rebecca absorbed the decision. She had known this moment would come eventually, the inevitable transition from active duty to advisory roles, but she had expected it to happen gradually, with dignity, not as an abrupt dismissal during the most important mission of her career. The younger officials around the table avoided her gaze, some looking genuinely uncomfortable with the decision they were witnessing. "I understand, sir," Rebecca said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "When will Major Chen be briefed on the mission parameters?" The general's expression softened slightly, recognizing the professionalism she was displaying, even in the face of what must feel like betrayal. "We'll begin her preparation immediately. I'd like you to assist with the briefing, given your extensive experience with the B-2 systems and stealth operations." Rebecca nodded, the irony not lost on her that she was being asked to train her replacement for the mission she should have been flying. As the meeting adjourned, she remained seated while the others filed out, staring at the satellite imagery that still glowed on the presentation screen. The target facility looked innocuous from above, just a collection of buildings in a remote valley. But she knew that beneath the surface lay the components of weapons that could kill millions of innocent people. The following hours passed in a blur of technical briefings and mission planning. Rebecca found herself in the uncomfortable position of sharing her expertise, while watching others prepare for the mission that represented everything she had trained for throughout her career. Major Chen absorbed the information with the intense focus of someone who understood the magnitude of what she was being asked to do, but Rebecca could see the uncertainty in her eyes when the conversation turned to the more complex aspects of stealth navigation. "Ma'am," Chen said during a break in the briefing, "I've read about your missions in Afghanistan, particularly the operation where you flew through that sandstorm to extract the Special Operations Team. How did you maintain navigation accuracy when all your instruments were compromised?" Rebecca smiled slightly, remembering that night when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and she had relied on instincts developed over years of flying to bring her aircraft and its precious cargo home safely. "You learn to trust your inner ear, your sense of the aircraft's attitude and movement," Rebecca explained. "The instruments are guides, but they can fail or be compromised. When that happens, you have to rely on the connection between you and the machine, the feel of how it responds to your inputs." Chen nodded, but Rebecca could see that the concept was still abstract to her, a theory rather than the visceral understanding that came from years of experience. The mission briefing revealed the full scope of the challenge ahead. The hostile nation had deployed multiple layers of air defense systems, including radar networks that were designed specifically to detect stealth aircraft. The flight path would require precise timing to exploit brief windows when satellite coverage created gaps in their surveillance. Any deviation from the planned route or timing would almost certainly result in detection and either the destruction of the aircraft or an international incident that could escalate into full-scale war. The approach to the target requires flying through a valley system that's less than 200 feet wide in some places, the mission planner explained, highlighting the route on a topographical map. The aircraft will need to maintain an altitude of no more than 50 feet above the valley floor to avoid radar detection from the surrounding peaks. Rebecca studied the map, noting the sharp turns and elevation changes that would test the limits of both pilot and aircraft. Major Chen asked detailed questions about the technical aspects of the mission, her preparation thorough and professional. But Rebecca noticed that her questions focused on procedures and protocols rather than the kind of improvisational thinking that would be required when the inevitable unexpected complications arose. Chen was an excellent pilot by any measurable standard, but she had never faced the kind of crisis that revealed whether someone possessed the indefinable quality that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The weapons briefing added another layer of complexity to the mission. The specialized bunker-busting payload had never been deployed operationally, and its effects on the aircraft's handling characteristics were based on computer simulations rather than actual flight testing. The bomb's weight and configuration would alter the B-2's center of gravity, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight, particularly during the low-altitude portions of the mission. As the briefings concluded, Rebecca walked across the base toward her quarters, the weight of missed opportunity heavy on her shoulders. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the distant sound of aircraft engines that had been the soundtrack of her adult life. She passed younger airmen who saluted respectfully, unaware that they were witnessing the effective end of a career that had been built on breaking barriers and exceeding expectations. Her apartment felt smaller than usual as she sat at her desk, reviewing the mission materials one final time. The technical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable for someone with her experience. The political ramifications of failure were enormous, but she had flown missions before where the stakes were measured in lives rather than statistics. What frustrated her most was the knowledge that she was being sidelined, not because she lacked the skills to succeed, but because others doubted her ability to perform at the level she had maintained throughout her career. Rebecca sat in her apartment that evening, staring at a faded photograph on her desk. The image showed a much younger version of herself, standing next to Colonel Patricia Storm Williams, the first woman to command a combat squadron in the Air Force. Patricia had been Rebecca's mentor during her early years, a trailblazer who had faced even greater obstacles and skepticism than Rebecca ever encountered. The photograph had been taken after Rebecca's first successful combat mission in Iraq, when Patricia had pulled her aside for a conversation that would shape the rest of her career. "Listen to me, Hawk," Patricia had said, using the call sign. Rebecca had earned for her exceptional eyesight and tactical awareness. "They're going to spend your entire career telling you what you can't do. Too young, too inexperienced, too emotional, too old. The measurements keep changing, but the message stays the same." Patricia's weathered face had carried the lines of someone who had fought these battles for decades. "But here's what I learned flying through flak over Baghdad when half the squadron thought women didn't belong in cockpits. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about being so undeniably good that they can't ignore you." Rebecca remembered how Patricia had described her own experiences breaking barriers in military aviation. The isolation of being the only woman in briefing rooms full of men who questioned her presence. The extra scrutiny that meant every mistake was magnified while every success was minimized. The constant pressure to be perfect because anything less would be used as evidence that women didn't belong in combat roles. Patricia had endured it all with grace and determination, accumulating victories that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The military loves its traditions, Patricia had continued, but it loves winning more. When push comes to shove, when lives are on the line and the mission is critical, they'll send whoever gives them the best chance of success. Your job is to make sure that when that moment comes, you're ready. She had paused, looking directly into Rebecca's eyes. And when you get that chance, you don't just succeed, you excel. You show them something they've never seen before. The lessons had served Rebecca well throughout her career. When she was passed over for squadron command, because of concerns about her ability to lead men in combat, she had focused on becoming the most tactically proficient pilot in her unit. When younger pilots questioned her technical knowledge, she had studied aircraft systems until she knew them better than the engineers who designed them. When physical fitness standards were raised in what seemed like an attempt to force older pilots into retirement, she had trained until she could outperform officers half her age. Patricia had retired 5 years earlier, moving to a small town in Montana where she restored vintage aircraft as a hobby. But she had maintained contact with Rebecca, offering guidance and perspective during the challenging moments that every military career contained. Their conversations had evolved from mentor and student to peer sharing the unique experiences of women who had spent their lives proving they belonged in places where they weren't initially welcome. Rebecca picked up her phone and dialed Patricia's number, needing to hear the voice of someone who would understand the frustration and disappointment she was feeling. The call connected after several rings, and Patricia's familiar voice came through with its characteristic warmth and strength. "Hawk, I was wondering when you'd call," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she had been following events through the informal networks that connected retired and active military personnel. "I heard through the grapevine that something big is happening out there." Rebecca wasn't surprised that Patricia had sources of information that kept her informed about significant operations. The military aviation community was small enough that important developments rarely remained secret for long. "Storm, they're sidelining me," Rebecca said, the words carrying more emotion than she had intended. "There's a mission that I'm more qualified for than anyone else in the Air Force, and they're giving it to someone else because they think I'm too old." She explained the situation without revealing classified details, describing the technical challenges and the decision-making process that had led to her exclusion. Patricia listened without interruption, her silence conveying understanding rather than judgment. When Rebecca finished, there was a long pause before Patricia spoke. "Do you remember what I told you about the mission that made my career?" she asked. "The one where I flew through that storm system to get supplies to the troops who were cut off behind enemy lines?" Rebecca remembered the story, though Patricia had never shared all the details. It had become something of a legend in the aviation community, an example of exceptional flying under impossible conditions. "You've never told me the whole story," Rebecca said. "Because it wasn't just about the flying," Patricia replied. "It was about making a choice that went against everything I had been taught about following orders and staying in my lane. The mission commanders had decided the weather was too dangerous, that we should wait for conditions to improve. But I could see on the weather radar that there was a narrow window, maybe 30 minutes, where the storm had a gap we could fly through." Patricia's voice took on the intensity it always carried when she discussed flying. "I had 2 choices. I could follow orders and let those soldiers go without supplies for another day, knowing that some of them might not survive. Or I could trust my judgment, take the risk, and prove that sometimes experience matters more than caution." Rebecca felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced before every important decision in her career. "Chose to fly," Patricia continued. "And not just because I knew I could make it through that storm, but because I knew that if I didn't, they would use my failure as evidence that women couldn't be trusted with critical decisions." The stakes were bigger than just one mission. They were about whether the next generation of women would have the opportunities we had fought to create. The conversation continued for another hour, with Patricia sharing stories from her career that illustrated the delicate balance between following orders and following conscience. She described moments when she had to choose between personal advancement and doing what she believed was right, between the safety of conformity and the risks of leadership. Each story carried the same underlying message, that true leadership sometimes required acting against the expectations of others. "Hawk, I'm going to tell you something that might sound crazy," Patricia said as their conversation neared its end. "Some of the most important missions I ever flew were the ones I wasn't supposed to fly. The ones where I had to make the choice between being a good soldier and being the right person for the job." Rebecca felt a chill as she understood the implications of what Patricia was suggesting. "They're going to proceed with this mission whether you're involved or not," Patricia continued. "The question is whether you're going to let them fail because they were too stubborn to use their best pilot, or whether you're going to find a way to be where you need to be when they need you most." The line went quiet for a moment before Patricia added, "Just remember, Hawk, it's not about being seen. It's about seeing what others miss. And sometimes what they miss is that the person they need most is the one they're trying to leave behind." After ending the call, Rebecca sat in her apartment staring at the mission materials spread across her desk. The technical specifications, the flight path analysis, the intelligence assessments, all of it pointed to a mission that required exactly the kind of experience and judgment she had spent her career developing. She thought about Major Chen, undoubtedly spending these same hours preparing for the most important flight of her life, carrying the weight of national security on her shoulders. The decision Rebecca faced wasn't just about her career or her pride. It was about the lives that would be lost if the mission failed, about the precedent that would be set for how the military valued experience versus youth, about the message that would be sent to every woman who had ever been told she wasn't ready, wasn't suitable, wasn't enough. Patricia's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones you weren't supposed to fly. The next morning arrived with the crisp precision of military routine. Rebecca reported to the operations center at 0530, her uniform pressed and her bearing professional, despite the sleepless night she had endured. The base hummed with the controlled urgency that preceded major operations, though most personnel remained unaware of the true nature of the mission that would launch in less than 24 hours. She found herself assigned to what the Air Force euphemistically called mission support duties, monitoring communications, coordinating with intelligence assets, and providing technical expertise from the ground while others flew the mission. She should have been commanding. The operations center buzzed with activity as personnel from various agencies coordinated the complex logistics required for the stealth mission. Rebecca took her position at a workstation equipped with multiple monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds, weather data, and communication channels. Her official role was to serve as a technical advisor, available to answer questions about B-2 systems and stealth operations should complications arise during the mission. The irony of being relegated to a support role while possessing more operational knowledge than anyone else in the room wasn't lost on her. Major Chen arrived at the operations center looking composed but carrying the subtle tension that preceded high-stakes missions. She had spent the previous evening in intensive preparation, reviewing every aspect of the flight plan, studying the target area, and familiarizing herself with the specialized payload she would be carrying. Rebecca watched her interact with the mission planners, noting the way she asked precise questions and absorbed information with the focused intensity of someone who understood the magnitude of her responsibility. "Colonel Morrison," Chen approached Rebecca's workstation, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and uncertainty. "I was hoping you could review my approach calculations one more time." I want to make sure I'm accounting for all the variables that could affect the stealth configuration during the low-altitude portion of the mission. Rebecca pulled up the relevant data on her monitor, examining the flight parameters that would determine whether the B-2 remained invisible to enemy radar systems. The calculations were technically correct, but Rebecca noticed that Chen had chosen the most conservative approach to several critical decision points. While this reduced the risk of detection, it also created a narrower margin for error if conditions changed during the mission. "Your numbers are solid," Rebecca told her, "but you might want to consider building in some flexibility for the mountain passage. Weather conditions at altitude can change rapidly, and you may need to adjust your approach in real time." Chen nodded, making notes on her tablet. "What's your assessment of the most challenging phase of the mission?" she asked. Rebecca studied the flight plan, her experienced eye immediately focusing on the section that would test the limits of both pilot and aircraft. "The ingress through the valley system," she replied. "You'll be flying at night, at extremely low altitude, through terrain that doesn't forgive mistakes. Your navigation has to be perfect, and you'll need to trust your instruments even when your instincts are telling you to climb for safety." The briefing room filled with personnel as the final mission review began. Rebecca found herself in the back of the room, her advisory role placing her outside the inner circle of decision-makers and operational personnel. General Harrison conducted the briefing with the crisp efficiency of someone who had commanded similar operations throughout his career, but Rebecca could see the stress in his posture, the way his hands moved restlessly as he discussed contingency plans. "The target facility represents an imminent threat to American cities," Harrison explained, his words carrying the weight of intelligence that painted a horrifying picture of potential devastation. "Our window of opportunity is narrow, and we may not get a second chance if this mission fails." The assembled personnel absorbed this information with the professional calm of people accustomed to high-stakes operations, but Rebecca could sense the underlying tension that came with understanding the consequences of failure. The weather briefing added another layer of complexity to the mission. A storm system was moving through the region, bringing high winds and reduced visibility that would make the already challenging flight even more dangerous. The meteorologist explained that the conditions would be marginal for the entire mission, with particular concerns about wind shear in the mountain valleys that could affect the aircraft's handling characteristics. "Major Chen," Harrison addressed the pilot directly, "are you comfortable proceeding with these weather conditions?" Chen straightened in her chair, her response carrying the confidence required of someone about to risk everything on a single flight. "Yes, sir. I've reviewed the weather data extensively, and while the conditions are challenging, they remain within acceptable parameters for the mission." Rebecca felt a familiar knot form in her stomach as she listened to the exchange. Chen's response was technically correct, but it revealed a lack of appreciation for how quickly conditions could deteriorate during a mission that would last several hours. The weather briefing showed current conditions, but the reality of flying through a storm system was that predictions became increasingly unreliable as conditions evolved in real time. The intelligence briefing revealed additional complications that had emerged since the previous day's planning session. Satellite imagery showed increased activity at the target facility, suggesting that the enemy was aware of potential threats and had enhanced their defensive posture. New radar installations had been detected along the flight path, requiring last-minute adjustments to the route that would add complexity to an already challenging mission. The enemy's defensive preparations suggest they may be expecting some form of attack, the intelligence officer explained. However, our assessment is that they're preparing for conventional missile strikes rather than a stealth penetration. This gives us an advantage, but it also means that any deviation from the planned approach could trigger a response that would compromise the mission. Rebecca studied the updated intelligence data, noting patterns that suggested a sophisticated Understanding of American military capabilities. The enemy's defensive preparations were too precise to be based on general caution. They appeared to be responding to specific intelligence about American intentions. This raised troubling questions about operational security and the possibility that details of the mission had been compromised. As the briefing concluded, Rebecca remained in her seat while others dispersed to their final preparations. The operations center would remain active throughout the night, monitoring intelligence feeds and weather conditions, ready to provide support to the mission or abort if conditions became too dangerous. Her role would be to monitor communications and provide technical advice if problems arose, watching from the ground while others flew the mission that represented everything she had trained for throughout her career. The hours passed slowly as final preparations continued. Rebecca watched the systematic process of mission preparation, from the loading of the specialized payload to the final systems checks on the B-2 Spirit that would carry Major Chen into enemy territory. The aircraft sat on the tarmac like a predatory bird, its angular stealth configuration making it appear otherworldly under the harsh lights of the hangar. She had flown similar aircraft dozens of times, but had never seen one prepared for a mission of this magnitude. Major Chen appeared at Fayard Rebecca's workstation one final time before departing for her pre-flight preparations. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I understand the significance of this mission, and I won't let you down," she said. Rebecca looked up from her monitors, seeing in Chun's face the same mixture of determination and apprehension she had felt before. Her own first critical mission. "Just remember," Rebecca told her, "plans are important, but adaptability is what keeps you alive. Trust your training, but don't be afraid to trust your instincts when the situation changes." Chun nodded, her expression serious as she absorbed the advice. "And remember that you're not just flying for yourself. You're flying for everyone who will be affected by the success or failure of this mission." As Chun walked away toward the flight line, Rebecca felt the weight of watching someone else carry the burden she should have been bearing. The mission would launch in 6 hours, and she would be relegated to monitoring its progress from the ground, providing support and advice while others risked everything to accomplish what she knew she could do better than anyone else in the Air Force. The mission launch proceeded with mechanical precision at 0300 hours. Rebecca stood in the operations center, watching through the massive windows as the B-2 Spirit taxied toward the runway, its ghostly silhouette barely visible against the pre-dawn darkness. The aircraft moved with deliberate slowness, its $2.2 billion frame carrying the hopes of millions of people who would never know how close they had come to catastrophe. Major Chun's voice crackled through the communication system, reporting her pre-flight checks with the calm professionalism that masked the enormous pressure she was carrying. "Tower, this is Shadow 1, requesting clearance for takeoff." Chun's voice came through the speakers, using the call sign assigned for this mission. The air traffic controller's response was immediate and formal, granting permission for what would officially be recorded as a routine training flight. Rebecca watched the runway lights illuminate the path ahead as the B-2's engine spooled up, their distinctive sound muffled by the advanced, noise-dampening systems that were part of the aircraft's stealth technology. The takeoff was flawless, the massive aircraft lifting gracefully into the night sky before disappearing into the darkness beyond the base perimeter. Rebecca tracked the aircraft's progress on her monitor, watching the GPS coordinates update as Chen began the long journey toward enemy territory. The flight path would take her across multiple time zones, requiring aerial refueling over the Pacific Ocean before the final approach to the target. Every aspect of the mission had been planned with obsessive attention to detail, but Rebecca knew that no plan survived contact with reality unchanged at the first indication that problems were developing. Came 3 hours into the mission. The weather system that had been forecasted to remain stable was intensifying more rapidly than predicted, creating conditions that would test the limits of both pilot and aircraft. Rebecca watched the meteorological data update on her screen, noting wind speeds that were approaching the maximum safe operating parameters for the B-2's low-altitude flight profile. Operations, this is Shadow 1. Chun's voice came through the communication system, carrying the first hints of stress that she had displayed since the mission began. I'm encountering headwinds that are significantly stronger than briefed. Request updated weather analysis for the approach corridor. Rebecca immediately pulled up the latest satellite imagery, her experienced eye recognizing patterns that suggested conditions were deteriorating faster than the computer models had predicted. The meteorologist on duty began providing updated forecasts, but Rebecca could see that the official predictions were still understating the severity of the developing storm system. Her years of flying in challenging conditions had taught her to read weather patterns with an intuition that complemented the scientific data, and everything she was seeing suggested that Chen was heading into conditions that would push the mission beyond acceptable risk parameters. Major Chen, Rebecca spoke into her headset, using the direct communication channel that allowed her to provide technical advice. The wind patterns you're encountering are going to intensify as you approach the mountain corridor. Consider adjusting your approach altitude to compensate for the increased turbulence. Chun's response came after a brief pause, her voice carrying the strain of flying in increasingly difficult conditions. Roger that, Colonel. I'm noting significant variations in wind speed and direction. The aircraft is handling well, but I'm having to make constant adjustments to maintain course. Rebecca felt the familiar tension that came with monitoring a mission from the ground, knowing that she could provide advice but couldn't take control if the situation deteriorated beyond Chun's ability to handle it. The aerial refueling phase added another layer of complexity to the developing crisis. The KC-135 tanker aircraft that was scheduled to provide fuel for the B-2 was also encountering severe weather conditions, making the delicate process of mid-air refueling even more challenging than usual. Rebecca watched the real-time video feed from the tanker, seeing the B-2 struggling to maintain position in the turbulent air as the refueling boom extended toward the aircraft's fuel receptacle. Shadow 1, you're moving out of position, the tanker pilot reported, his voice carrying the professional concern of someone who understood the critical nature of the refueling operation. Recommend you come left and climb 50 feet to compensate for the wind shear. Chun's response revealed the increasing difficulty she was experiencing in maintaining control of the aircraft under these conditions. Unable to maintain stable position, Chun reported, her voice now clearly strained. The aircraft is experiencing significant turbulence, and I'm having difficulty compensating for the wind variations. Rebecca watched the video feed with growing concern, seeing the B-2 oscillating in the turbulent air as Chun struggled to keep it aligned with the tanker's refueling boom. The refueling operation that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to nearly an hour as Chun made repeated attempts to maintain the precise positioning required for fuel transfer. Each attempt was frustrated by wind gusts that pushed the aircraft out of alignment, requiring her to break away and reposition for another approach. Rebecca could hear the increasing fatigue in Chen's voice as she continued to battle conditions that were testing her skills to their limits. Operations, this is Shadow 1. Chun finally reported after a successful fuel transfer. Refueling complete, but I'm experiencing significant fatigue from the extended maneuvering in these conditions. Request assessment of continuing the mission versus aborting due to weather. The request sent a wave of tension through the operations center as personnel realized that the mission was in jeopardy before Chun had even reached enemy territory. General Morrison moved to Rebecca's workstation, his expression grim as he studied the weather data and mission parameters. What's your assessment, Colonel? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could affect millions of lives. Rebecca studied the data carefully, her experience allowing her to visualize the challenges that Chen would face during the most critical phases of the mission. "Sir, the weather conditions are beyond what Major Chen trained for," Rebecca said carefully, choosing her words to convey the severity of the situation without directly criticizing the younger pilot's capabilities. "The turbulence she's experiencing now is going to be amplified when she reaches the mountain corridor. The precision required for the low-altitude approach may be compromised by the constant need to compensate for wind variations." Harrison's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications of Rebecca's assessment. "Are you recommending we abort the mission?" he asked. Rebecca felt the weight of the moment, knowing that her next words could determine whether the mission continued or whether they would have to find another way to neutralize the threat that was developing thousands of miles away. "Sir, I'm recommending that we consider all available options," Rebecca replied diplomatically. "Major Chen is an excellent pilot, but she's facing conditions that would challenge anyone. The question is whether we're willing to accept the increased risk of mission failure or whether we have alternatives that might improve our chances of success." Harrison nodded slowly, understanding the subtext of Rebecca's response. The conversation was interrupted by another transmission from Chen, her voice now carrying unmistakable signs of stress and fatigue. "Operations, I'm going to need updated navigation data for the approach corridor. The wind conditions are affecting my planned route, and I need to recalculate the timing for the final approach." Rebecca immediately began working on the requested calculations, but she could see that the problems were multiplying faster than solutions could be developed. The weather system was not only intensifying but also moving in an unexpected direction, creating conditions along the approach route that hadn't been accounted for in the original mission planning. The mountain corridor that Chen would need to navigate was now experiencing wind shear that could make low-altitude flight extremely dangerous, if not impossible. Rebecca realized that they were approaching a decision point where continuing the mission might result in the loss of both pilot and aircraft without accomplishing the objective. "General," Rebecca said quietly, "we need to make a decision soon. The window for safe passage through the mountain corridor is closing rapidly, and if we wait much longer, even aborting the mission may become dangerous." Harrison studied the data one more time, his expression revealing the terrible burden of command decisions that affected not just the success of the mission, but the lives of everyone involved. The crisis deepened as Chen's transmissions became increasingly urgent. "Operations, I'm encountering severe downdrafts approaching the mountain corridor. The aircraft is responding sluggishly to control inputs, and I'm having difficulty maintaining altitude." Rebecca watched the telemetry data streaming across her monitors, seeing the erratic flight path that indicated Chen was struggling to maintain control of the B-2 in conditions that were rapidly exceeding the aircraft's design parameters. "General." Harrison stood behind Rebecca's workstation, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of her chair. The weight of command had never been more evident on his face as he processed the reality that his carefully planned mission was disintegrating in real time. "Colonel Morrison, I need your honest assessment. Can Major Chen complete this mission successfully under these conditions?" Rebecca studied the data carefully, her years of experience allowing her to visualize exactly what Chen was experiencing in the cockpit. The turbulence readings were off the charts. The wind shear data showed conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilot, and the weather system was continuing to intensify rather than stabilize as predicted. "Sir, Major Chen is fighting a losing battle against conditions that are beyond what anyone trained for. The aircraft is being pushed to its structural limits, and pilot fatigue is becoming a critical factor." The communication channel crackled with Chen's voice, now carrying unmistakable signs of panic. "Operations, I've lost navigation reference. The GPS system is showing erratic readings, possibly due to electromagnetic interference from the storm. System, I'm flying on instruments alone, and the terrain warnings are activating continuously." Rebecca felt her heart sink as she realized that the mission was not just failing, but that Chun's life was now in immediate danger. Shadow One, can you climb to a safer altitude? Harrison asked directly, his command voice cutting through the key. Static. Chun's response came after a terrifying pause that lasted nearly 30 seconds. Negative operations. I'm trapped below the cloud deck by the mountain peaks. Climbing would put me in radar detection range, and I can't see the terrain clearly enough to navigate safely. Rebecca watched the aircraft's position on her screen, seeing it weaving erratically through the mountain corridor as Chun struggled to maintain control. The B-2 was designed for precision flight, but the current conditions were turning it into a barely controllable projectile, hurtling through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Every instinct Rebecca had developed over 3 decades of flying told her that Chun was moments away from a catastrophic impact. Sir, Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had spent her career preparing for exactly this moment. We need to abort this mission immediately and guide Major Chun to safety. She's reached the limits of her capabilities, and continuing will result in the loss of aircraft and pilot. Harrison's expression showed the agony of a commander facing an impossible choice between mission success and the life of his pilot. Before Harrison could respond, the communication channel erupted with alarm sounds from Chun's aircraft. Mayday, Mayday, this is Shadow One. I've lost primary flight control. The aircraft is not responding to stick inputs, and I'm experiencing rapid altitude loss. Rebecca's blood turned to ice as she realized that the B-2 was now in an uncontrolled descent through mountainous terrain in zero visibility conditions. Shadow One, attempt to engage backup flight control systems, Rebecca transmitted, her voice steady despite the crisis unfolding before her. Check your hydraulic pressure readings and try to regain control authority. The response came back filled with static and the sound of alarms, Chun's voice barely audible above the chaos in the cockpit. I've tried everything, operations. The aircraft is not responding. I'm preparing for emergency ejection. Rebecca stared at the screen showing Chun's position, calculating the terrain and weather conditions that would determine whether the pilot could survive an ejection at low altitude in a mountain storm. The odds were not favorable, and the loss of the aircraft would eliminate any chance of completing the mission. In that moment of crisis, Rebecca made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She stood up from her workstation and walked directly to General Harrison, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent her life preparing for this exact situation. Sir, I'm requesting immediate authorization to take over this mission. I can reach the backup B-2 in Hangar 7 and be airborne within 30 minutes. Harrison stared at her in shock, the request so unexpected that he seemed unable to process it initially. Colonel, that's impossible. The backup aircraft isn't configured for this mission, and you don't have authorization to fly combat operations. Rebecca met his gaze with the steady confidence that had carried her through every challenge of her career. General, I can configure that aircraft for the mission parameters while it's being prepped for takeoff. I know every system on that plane better than anyone else in this facility, and I can fly it in conditions that would kill other pilots. She gestured toward the screen showing Chun's deteriorating situation. We have maybe 10 minutes before we lose Major Chun completely, and after that, we lose our only chance to complete this mission. The operations center had gone completely silent as personnel realized they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered in military history. Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had spent her career being told she wasn't ready, wasn't suitable, wasn't enough. Sir, I've flown combat missions in conditions that existed only in nightmares. I've brought damaged aircraft home when everyone else said it was impossible. I've spent 30 years preparing for exactly this moment. Harrison looked at the screens showing Chun's desperate situation, then back at Rebecca's determined face. Colonel, even if I authorize this insane plan, You'd be flying into the worst weather conditions in the region, with no backup support, carrying a nuclear payload toward a target that's defended by the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. Rebecca nodded, understanding every word of the assessment. Yes, sir. And I'm the only pilot in this facility who has the experience to succeed under those conditions. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. General Major Chen is about to die because we sent someone who wasn't ready for this mission. Don't let the mission fail for the same reason. The radio crackled with what might have been Chen's final transmission. Operations, I'm losing consciousness. The aircraft is in an unrecoverable spin. I'm ejecting now. The channel went silent except for static, and Rebecca felt the weight of a young pilot's life hanging in the balance while the most critical mission in recent American history teetered on the edge of complete failure. Harrison stared at the silent radio for a long moment, then looked back at Rebecca. Colonel Morrison, you have 30 minutes to get that aircraft ready and airborne. God help us all, but you're authorized to complete this mission. Rebecca felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized that after being sidelined and dismissed, she was finally going to fly the mission that would define her legacy. She turned and ran toward the hangar, her mind already calculating the modifications needed to configure the backup B-2 for the mission parameters. Behind her, the operations center erupted into controlled chaos as personnel scrambled to support the most desperate gambit in recent military history. Rebecca Morrison, the pilot who was too old for combat, was about to prove that sometimes experience mattered more than age, and that the most unlikely heroes emerged when everything else had failed. Rebecca sprinted across the tarmac toward Hangar 7, her boots pounding against the concrete as maintenance crews scrambled to prepare the backup B-2 Spirit for immediate launch. The aircraft sat in the hangar like a sleeping giant, its angular stealth configuration gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She had flown this particular airframe dozens of times during test flights, knowing every subtle characteristic that distinguished it from other B-2 South in the fleet. The maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, looked up in surprise as she burst through the hangar doors. "Colonel, what's the emergency?" Rodriguez asked, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing the urgency in Rebecca's demeanor. "We need this aircraft configured for the Shadow mission profile and ready for takeoff in 25 minutes, Rebecca replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just been given an impossible task and intended to accomplish. Rodriguez's expression shifted from surprise to disbelief as he processed the implications of her request. "Ma'am, that's impossible. The mission-specific modifications alone would take hours to install and test." Rebecca was already moving toward the aircraft, her hands automatically checking systems and configurations as she spoke. "Sergeant, I don't need the full modification package. I need the basic stealth configuration optimized for low-altitude flight, and I need the weapons bay prepped for the special payload. Everything else I can manage through pilot technique and system manipulation." The hangar erupted into controlled chaos as maintenance crews began the frantic process of preparing the aircraft for a mission they had never imagined possible. Rebecca climbed into the cockpit, her fingers flying across the instrument panels, as she began the complex process of configuring the aircraft systems for the unique demands of the mission. The familiar environment of the B-2's cockpit felt like coming home after a long absence, every switch and display exactly where her muscle memory expected them to be. "Colonel Morrison, this is operations," General Harrison's voice came through her headset. "Satellite imagery shows that Major Chen's aircraft impacted in the mountains approximately 12 minutes ago. Search and rescue teams are being dispatched, but weather conditions are preventing immediate recovery operations." Rebecca felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she absorbed the news, knowing that a promising young pilot had paid the ultimate price for a mission that should have been hers from the beginning. "Sir, I'm almost ready for engine start," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of Chun's loss. The aircraft systems are responding normally, and the payload is being loaded now. She watched through the cockpit windows as the specialized, bunker-busting weapon was carefully positioned in the B-2's weapons bay. Its considerable weight requiring precise balance calculations to maintain the aircraft's stealth characteristics. Weather briefing update that came through her headset painted a grim picture of the conditions she would face. The storm system had continued to intensify, creating wind shear and turbulence that exceeded the design parameters of most military aircraft. The mountain corridor that she would need to navigate was now experiencing downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning, while the approach to the target was complicated by visibility that was essentially zero. Shadow 2, this is operations. The controller's voice came through the communication system, using her new call sign for the mission. Current weather conditions at the target area show sustained winds of 65 knots, with gusts to 90 knots. Visibility is less than 1/4 mile, and the cloud deck extends from the surface to 30,000 feet. Rebecca absorbed the information without comment, knowing that these were precisely the conditions that had defeated Chun's attempt to complete the mission. Engine start proceeded smoothly, the B-2's 4 turbofan engine spooling up with a distinctive whine that she had heard thousands of times before. The aircraft systems came online in sequence, each green indicator light confirming that the hastily configured bomber was ready for what might be the most challenging mission in stealth aviation history. Rebecca ran through her pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, her hands moving across the controls with the automatic precision that came from decades of experience. Shadow 2, you are cleared for immediate takeoff, the tower controller announced. Wind is 270 at 45 knots, gusts to 60. Runway conditions are wet, but adequate for departure. Rebecca advanced the throttles, feeling the familiar surge of power as the B-2 began its takeoff roll. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with surprising speed despite the heavy payload, lifting off into the stormy night sky that had already claimed one pilot and aircraft. The initial climb was rough, with turbulence that would have been uncomfortable in any aircraft and was particularly challenging in the B-2's fly-by-wire configuration. Rebecca fought to maintain control as the aircraft was buffeted by wind gusts that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Her years of experience flying in adverse conditions served her well as she instinctively compensated for the aircraft's movements, maintaining a steady climb rate despite the chaotic atmospheric conditions. Shadow 2, radar contact established. The controller reported, you are cleared direct to waypoint Alpha as filed. Contact approach control on frequency 285.7. Rebecca acknowledged the transmission while simultaneously managing the aircraft's complex stealth systems, ensuring that her radar signature remained minimal despite the challenging flight conditions. The B-2 stealth technology was most effective when the aircraft maintained specific flight parameters, but the turbulence was making it difficult to hold steady course and altitude. The flight toward the target area became a test of endurance, as Rebecca battled continuous turbulence that seemed to intensify with each passing hour. The aircraft's autopilot system was unable to maintain stable flight in these conditions, requiring constant manual control inputs that gradually sapped her strength and concentration. She drew on techniques learned during her most challenging combat missions, using breathing exercises and mental focus strategies to maintain peak performance despite the physical and psychological stress. The aerial refueling rendezvous proved to be even more challenging than Chun had experienced. The KC-135 tanker aircraft was struggling to maintain stable flight in the severe turbulence, its larger size making it more susceptible to the wind gusts that were rocking both aircraft. Rebecca approached the tanker with the patience and precision that came from years of experience, making small corrections to her flight path as she closed the distance to the refueling boom. Shadow 2, you're looking good, the tanker pilot reported as Rebecca positioned the B-2 beneath the extended boom. We're going to have to work quickly due to the turbulence. I can't maintain stable position for extended periods. Rebecca acknowledged the transmission while fine-tuning her position relative to the tanker, her hands making constant small adjustments to the flight controls as both aircraft were buffeted by the violent air currents. The refueling connection was made successfully, but maintaining the precise positioning required for fuel transfer proved to be a supreme test of piloting skill. Rebecca found herself in a continuous battle to keep the B-2 aligned with the tanker's boom as wind gusts tried to push the aircraft out of position. Her arms ached from the constant control inputs required to maintain formation, but she drew on reserves of strength and determination that she had developed throughout her career. Fuel transfer complete, the tanker pilot announced after what felt like an eternity of precise formation flying. Shadow 2, you're showing full tanks. Good luck on your mission. Rebecca disconnected from the tanker and began the final approach to the target area, knowing that the most challenging phase of the mission lay ahead. The mountain corridor that had defeated Chen was now visible on her navigation display, its narrow confines looking impossibly small for an aircraft the size of the B-2. As she approached the mountain corridor, Rebecca felt the familiar calm that had always settled over her during the most critical moments of her career. The turbulence that had been challenging her for hours suddenly seemed manageable, the aircraft's responses more predictable. She was in her element now, flying by instinct and experience in conditions that would have terrified most pilots. The mountain peaks rose around her like ghostly sentinels in the storm, their snow-covered summits barely visible in the swirling clouds. Shadow 2 approaching the corridor, she reported to operations, her voice steady despite the extreme conditions. Beginning low-altitude approach to target. The response came back immediately, General Harrison's voice carrying both hope and concern. Roger, Shadow 2, you are cleared for the approach. All personnel are standing by for mission completion. Rebecca descended into the mountain corridor, the B-2's navigation systems painting a three-dimensional picture of the terrain that surrounded her. The passage was barely wide enough for the aircraft's wingspan, requiring precision flying that left no room for error. She flew by pure instinct now, her hands responding to subtle cues from the aircraft that told her when to climb, when to descend, when to bank left or right to follow the twisting path through the mountains. The final approach to the target required flying at an altitude of less than 50 feet above the valley floor, threading the needle between radar installations while maintaining the precise speed and heading required for weapon delivery. Rebecca could see the target facility ahead, its lights barely visible through the storm. She armed the weapon system and began the final attack run, knowing that the next 30 seconds would determine whether millions of lives would be saved or lost. The target facility materialized through the storm like a fortress carved from the mountain itself, its concrete structures barely visible against the rocky terrain. Rebecca's hands remained steady on the controls as she initiated the final attack sequence, the B-2's sophisticated targeting systems painting the underground complex with invisible laser designators. The facility's air defense systems had been designed to detect conventional aircraft approaching from high altitude, but they were blind to the stealth bomber skimming the valley floor at treetop level through the raging storm. Weapon systems armed and ready, Rebecca announced over the communication channel, her voice carrying the calm precision of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. The specialized bunker-busting payload hung in the aircraft's weapons bay, its precisely calculated explosive yield designed to penetrate the facility's underground chambers without causing widespread radioactive contamination. Everything depended on the accuracy of the delivery, requiring her to place the weapon within a margin of error measured in feet rather than yards. The approach corridor narrowed as Rebecca guided the B-2 between towering rock formations that seemed to close in around the aircraft like the jaws of some ancient predator. Her navigation display showed the optimal release point approaching rapidly, but the storm was creating wind conditions that threatened to push the aircraft off course at the critical moment. She made constant micro-adjustments to the flight path, her years of experience allowing her to anticipate the aircraft's responses to the turbulent air currents. Shadow 2, you are 30 seconds from release point, operations reported, the tension in the controller's voice reflecting the magnitude of the moment. Rebecca acknowledged the transmission while fine-tuning the aircraft's position relative to the target, her thumb hovering over the weapon release button. The facility's defensive systems remained inactive, their operators apparently unaware that death was approaching through the storm at nearly the speed of sound. The release came at exactly the calculated moment, the heavy payload dropping cleanly from the weapons bay and beginning its terminal dive toward the underground complex. Rebecca immediately initiated evasive maneuvers, banking the B-2 sharply to avoid the blast effects while maintaining the low altitude necessary to avoid radar detection. The aircraft shuddered as it fought through the violent air currents, but her skilled hands kept it on course as she began the escape phase of the mission. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced, even during her years of combat operations. The specialized weapon penetrated deep into the facility's underground chambers before detonating, creating a seismic shock that shook the entire mountain range. The blast wave caught up with the B-2 moments later, buffeting the aircraft with forces that tested the limits of its structural integrity. Rebecca fought to maintain control as the shockwave passed, her instruments showing stress readings that approached the aircraft's maximum design parameters. "Target destroyed," she reported to operations, her voice steady despite the violence of the explosion that had just occurred behind her. "Beginning egress to extraction point." The response came back immediately, General Harrison's voice carrying relief that was evident even through the static-filled communication channel. "Outstanding work, Shadow 2. Satellite imagery confirms complete destruction of the target facility. All defensive systems have gone silent." The escape from the mountain corridor proved to be nearly as challenging as the approach, with the added complication of flying through the seismic disturbances created by the explosion. Rebecca guided the B-2 through the twisting valley system, her navigation system showing the planned egress route that would take her away from the target area and toward the relative safety of international airspace. The storm continued to rage around the aircraft, but she no longer noticed the turbulence that had seemed so threatening hours earlier. As she cleared the mountain peaks and began climbing toward cruising altitude, Rebecca felt the familiar sense of completion that followed successful combat missions. The target had been destroyed, the threat to American cities had been eliminated, and she had accomplished what the younger pilot had been unable to do. But the satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that Major Chen had paid the ultimate price for a mission that should have been hers from the beginning. "Shadow 2, this is operations." General Harrison's voice came through her headset as she established communications with the command center. Preliminary intelligence reports confirmed that the facility's nuclear materials have been completely neutralized. There are no signs of radioactive contamination, and the weapon's effects were contained within the target parameters. Rebecca acknowledged the information while running through post-mission procedures, her hands automatically performing the systematic checks that would ensure the aircraft's safe return. The flight back to base became a time for reflection as Rebecca settled into the long transit across multiple time zones. The storm system gradually weakened as she flew away from the target area, eventually giving way to clear skies that revealed the dawn breaking over the Pacific Ocean. The B-2 performed flawlessly during the return journey, its systems operating within normal parameters despite the stresses of the mission. The aerial refueling for the return leg proceeded without incident. the tanker crew's professionalism evident in their smooth coordination with the stealth bomber. Rebecca found herself thinking about the conversation she had had with Patricia Williams, her mentor's words about making choices that went against expectations resonating with the events of the past 12 hours. She had indeed flown a mission. She wasn't supposed to fly, proving that sometimes the most important operations required the kind of experience that came only from years of facing the impossible. As Edwards Air Force Base appeared on the horizon, Rebecca felt a mixture of emotions that she had experienced after every successful mission throughout her career. The satisfaction of accomplishing something that others had deemed impossible. The sadness of losses that could have been prevented, and the quiet pride of knowing that she had made a difference when it mattered most. The landing approach was routine compared to the challenges she had faced during the mission, the familiar runway lights guiding her home after the most significant flight of her career. The operations center erupted in controlled celebration. As the B-2 touched down, personnel who had monitored the mission for hours finally able to release the tension that had built throughout the night. Rebecca taxied the aircraft to its designated parking area, where maintenance crews waited to begin the post-mission inspection that would determine whether the stealth bomber had sustained any damage during its ordeal. She shut down the engines and remained in the cockpit for a moment, absorbing the significance of what had just occurred. General Harrison met her at the aircraft, his expression showing a mixture of relief, gratitude, and what might have been embarrassment at the circumstances that had led to her flying the mission. "Colonel Morrison," he said as she climbed down from the cockpit, "I owe you an apology. This mission succeeded because of your experience and skill, qualities that I should have recognized from the beginning." Rebecca accepted the acknowledgement with the grace that had characterized her entire career, understanding that the general's words represented more than just personal recognition. The debriefing that followed revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished during the mission. The target facility had been completely destroyed, eliminating the nuclear threat that had hung over American cities for weeks. Intelligence gathered from the site confirmed that the hostile nation had been closer to deploying nuclear weapons than previously known, making the mission's success even more critical than originally understood. Rebecca's precision flying had not only completed the mission, but had done so without creating the international incident that failure would have guaranteed. The news media, operating under strict security guidelines, reported only that a routine training exercise had been conducted, with no mention of the nuclear threat or the dramatic circumstances that had led to the mission's success. The American public would never know how close they had come to catastrophe, or how an overlooked pilot had saved millions of lives by proving that experience and determination could overcome any obstacle. In the days that followed, Rebecca found herself at the center of a quiet transformation within the Air Force's approach to pilot assignments and mission planning. The success of her mission had demonstrated that age and experience were assets rather than liabilities, leading to changes in policies that had previously sidelined older pilots. She was offered promotion to Brigadier General and command of the most advanced stealth aviation program in the military, recognition that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The memorial service for Major Chen was held with full military honors, attended by colleagues who understood that the young pilot had died trying to accomplish something that required skills she had not yet developed. Rebecca spoke at the service, emphasizing Chen's dedication and professionalism while acknowledging the harsh reality that some missions required experience that couldn't be taught in simulators or acquired through academic study. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in a different briefing room, addressing a group of pilots who represented the next generation of stealth aviation. Her audience included both young officers eager to prove themselves and older pilots who had been given new opportunities to contribute their experience to critical missions. The transformation in military thinking that had followed her successful Mission was evident in the diverse backgrounds and ages of the personnel who now formed the elite units, responsible for the nation's most sensitive operations. The mission you're preparing for will test every skill you've developed throughout your careers, she told the assembled pilots, her words carrying the authority of someone who had faced the ultimate test and succeeded. Some of you will rely on quick reflexes and technical precision. Others will draw on years of experience and hard-won wisdom. Both approaches are valuable, but the most important thing you can bring to any mission is the understanding that success often requires doing what others believe is impossible. As she looked out at the faces of the pilots who would carry on the mission of protecting American interests around the world, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From being dismissed as too old for combat to proving that age and experience were irreplaceable assets, she had demonstrated that the most unlikely heroes often emerged when conventional wisdom failed. The pilot who had been considered past her prime had flown the mission that saved America, proving that sometimes the most important flights were taken by those who were told they were no longer ready to fly. 3 years later, Rebecca Morrison stood at the podium of the Air Force Academy, addressing the newest class of cadets. Her uniform now bore the stars of a brigadier general, but more importantly, it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had changed the very definition of what it meant to serve. In the audience sat Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Major Chen's younger sister, who had enrolled in the academy after her sister's death, determined to honor her family's legacy of service. "When I was your age," Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium, "I was told I wasn't strong enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't young enough. I spent my career proving that limitations exist only in the minds of those who choose to accept them." She paused, her eyes finding Sarah Chen in the crowd. "But the most important lesson I learned came from a pilot who died trying to complete a mission that required skills she hadn't yet developed. Major Lisa Chen taught me that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about flying into the storm even when you're afraid." The Academy's new training program, developed under Rebecca's guidance, now emphasized experience alongside youth, wisdom alongside speed. Pilots were no longer forced into early retirement based on arbitrary age limits, and mission assignments were made based on capability rather than assumptions. The changes had already prevented 3 potential disasters where seasoned pilots had succeeded where younger ones might have failed. As Rebecca concluded her speech, she noticed a familiar figure in the back of the auditorium. Colonel Patricia Williams, now in her 70s, but still sharp as ever, gave her a subtle nod of approval. The mentorship chain that had sustained them both continued, passing from one generation to the next, ensuring that the lessons learned at 40,000 feet in a raging storm would never be forgotten. "Remember," Rebecca told the cadets, "it's not about being the youngest or the oldest, the fastest or the strongest. It's about being the right person in the right place when your country needs you most. Sometimes that person is someone everyone else has overlooked." The woman they said was too old for combat had not only saved America, she had changed it forever. Her legacy lived on in every pilot who refused to accept limitations, in every mission that succeeded because experience trumped assumptions, and in every young officer who learned that true strength comes from proving yourself when everyone else has given up on you. If this story inspired you to see beyond limitations and recognize that our greatest heroes often come from the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to prove what you're capable of. What story of unexpected heroism would you like to hear next? Let us know in the comments below.